All right, ladies and gentlemen, today is the 30th of September. Tonight is supposed to be the government shutdown. All of the Democrats, including the newly elected Congresswoman from Arizona in the special election that would be sworn in immediately to become the 218th vote to force the release of the... Anyway, the only thing the Democrats have demanded is to keep the tax cuts in place and for the ACA, for the Affordable Care Act. That is the only thing they have demanded. Of course, the Cheeto von Schitzenpants has to have some sort of a Trump show storyline that comes out with this big press conference from the Oral Gold office with Dr. Oz over his shoulder and the brainworm hophead over the other shoulder, with this big presser about how they're forcing a drug company to charge less, how only Donald Trump can possibly do that. And everyone who spoke, of course, had to say every other word about, it's only with your leadership. It's only with your leadership, Donald Trump, President Trump, the best that you could do. No one could have done this. No one. No one but you, Donald. Anyway, that type of press conference where they're talking about forcing drug companies to charge American citizens less than they charge everywhere else, or at least the least amount that they charge everywhere else, which is actually a big deal, and that's a huge thing. And because no one's been able to do it but Donald Trump, they're forgetting that there was actually a law put in place in the 80s that was never really used, that if a drug company was receiving tax subsidies or whatever during the R&D of the drugs or whatever, they would have to charge less in America. That was never enforced. It was put in by, I forget who, I think a Republican, for the show, so it looked like they cared about it, and then they didn't enforce it, so it really didn't matter. Well, one thing Biden did was actually amend that to say if they are asked to lower prices and make it the equivalent of what they're charging other places in those situations, then the federal government has the right to actually rescind their patents and their copyrights, which opens it up to other people to make generic versions, which would force it to come down. And that was something Joe Biden did put in place, but the Republican Congress would never enforce. But now the big thing that's supposed to be the distraction from shutting down the government, which they blame on Democrats as well, even though they're in charge of anything anyway, is that Donald Trump is actually paying attention to that. And if you don't believe me, here's some guy from some drug company over there. So that's what's going on today, right after Pete Kegsbreath publicly invited the top of the military, the tippity-toppity top of actual civil servants who have defended this country, no matter who was in office, demanded they go to Quantico at the same time, which is really the stupidest thing you could possibly do as far as security is concerned. And oh, by the way, maybe even the president will show up and talk, which he did. That he turned into a speech about how they have to go into all these cities because they're war zones, and what better way than going into war-ravaged cities like Portland, Oregon, and Washington, D.C., and San Francisco than to have these actual veterans that have been on the front line for decades and decades and decades sit there and talk about invading our cities, which is mainly just a scare tactic for the Trump show and to get us used to a military presence in our cities, especially the ones that have something to do with the vote, in case stuff goes crazy after some election or something. So if you follow the storylines of all this, you'll figure out how bad he's embarrassing himself, how bad he's embarrassing this country, and how big of an idiot he's making of all of us. But if you see the military, they don't like it and they will stand up.